amen, amen, Shem, Nora. Amen, amen, amen. כלדיר נורא והיום לעמך תנפיות ויברך אתכם היום ואמרו כל העם אמן. כלדיר ונורא יגיל וידיר התורה ויפתח לנו שערי אורה ואמרו כל העם אמן. נקל שואל שבח כי עלינו לשבח בשיר מזמור למנצח ובירושלים אמן. נשיר בשיר בשבח בשיר מזמור למנצח ונאמר עלינו לשבח ואמרו כל העם אמן.
Welcome to this brief talk about the Western Sephardi Jews, their fascinating history, and beautiful traditions. Let's now begin our journey. It all began with this notorious document, the Alhambra Decree, which will forever live in the memories of Jews. The King and Queen of Spain issued it less than 3 months after the surrender of Granada, the last remaining Spanish territory in Muslim hands. In it, Jews were accused of trying to subvert the Holy Catholic faith and ordered to convert to Christianity or leave the country. They were given just 3 months, and the punishment for any Jew who did not convert or leave by the deadline was death without trial. Sadly, it's not the first time the Jews had been expelled from a country. From the 13th to 16th centuries, European countries expelled the Jews on at least 15 occasions. 1290 from England, 1306 from France, 1348 from parts of Germany, 1421 from Austria, 1483 from Portugal, and 1492 from Spain. So what did the Jews of Spain do? An estimated 300,000 of them at the time. To where did they flee? Many went to North Africa, to an area known as the Maghreb. Others fled to southeastern Europe, to Salonika, Constantinople, and Sarajevo. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire actually dispatched his navy to bring the Jews, saying, quote, "How can you call Ferdinand of Aragon a wise king? He has impoverished his own land and enriched ours." Some fled across the Pyrenees to Bordeaux and Bayonne in southern France. And finally, many went to nearby Portugal. It is these Jews who fled to Portugal that we are going to focus on primarily. When the Inquisition in Spain began in 1492, Portugal at first welcomed the Jews. But in 1496, the King of Portugal, in order for his son to marry the daughter of Spain's monarchs, agreed to expel the Jews too. However, he was reluctant to lose the Jews with their abilities and money, and so at the last minute, he forcibly converted all of them. And for a time, the conversion was not strictly enforced, and the Jews managed to live outwardly as Christians and quietly as Jews. But in 1536, when the Inquisition came to Portugal for real, the Jews realized they had to leave, and it is estimated there were 134 Jewish communities, numbering 100,000 at the time, or 10% of the total Portuguese population. But by 1631, it is estimated the Jewish population was reduced to just 10,000. So where did the Jews go next? Many went to Italy, to Venice, and to the Jewish ghetto, joining German and Italian Jews already there. Each community built their own synagogue. This one, shown above, was built by the Spanish Jews in 1584 and still holds services today. Venice became an important center for Jewish knowledge and learning, and Venetian scholars would travel to help new communities in London and Amsterdam. By 1583, Jews had also found their way to Livorno, encouraged by the Medici family, which, like the Sultan decades earlier, realized that Spain and Portugal's loss was their gain. Among others, the Jews of Livorno became renowned printers. Some 17 Jewish printing presses were founded there, supplying liturgical books to Jewish communities throughout North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Spanish and Portuguese Jews also settled in Ferrara, where the local duke, like the Medicis, invited the Jews to settle, and by the middle of the 16th century, there were 10 synagogues in Ferrara. An important figure in helping Jews to escape the Inquisition was this lady, Donna Gracia Nasi, essentially the Queen Esther of her time. Donna Gracia was born in Lisbon in 1510 to a Jewish family that had fled Spain and had been forcibly converted. Upon the death of her husband, Donna Gracia found herself in charge of the family's massive European banking and trading business, and one of the wealthiest women of Renaissance Europe. She would use that power to help thousands of other converso Jews flee to safety in the Ottoman Empire. She did this even as European monarchs sought to take away her wealth, and it was only by clever maneuvers that she managed to outwit them all. She was even an early Zionist working to reestablish Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Many Portuguese Jews fled to Amsterdam, one of the few places in Europe that would accept them. Jews were already coming to Amsterdam as traders and referred to merely as the Portuguese. But when the Dutch gained independence in 1581, they were still welcomed and even encouraged to come out as Jews. Services were first held quietly in private homes as well as in the residence of the Moroccan ambassador, who was a Sephardi Jew. But by 1606 there was an official congregation, and by 1639 there were 3, including the famous Synagogue, which still exists today. In Amsterdam, the Portuguese Jews had to undergo a process of re-education, having lived so long as Jews in secret. As one writer describes it, these were men and women whose grandparents had already known neither synagogue nor house of study, yet they continued to flee abroad in order to bring their Jewish faith to full flower and to rejoin the living body of the Jewish people. Another important step was the changing of their names. Some families managed to remember their original surnames from the 15th century, while others secretly gave their children Hebrew first names. Couples who had married in Spain or Portugal in a Christian ceremony now remarried in a Jewish ceremony, and Portuguese Jews would begin to attend services, usually with a Spanish translation of the prayer book in their hands, and they began to study the Bible and all the basics of Judaism and halakha. To help them, they recruited rabbis and hazzanim from Italy, as well as Morocco and Salonika, to teach them. The Jews of Amsterdam enjoyed enormous freedom and played a significant part in the cultural and economic life there, producing rabbis, scholars, philosophers, artists, and bankers. And some of them came to know the illustrious painter Rembrandt, who lived for years in the Jewish quarter. Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel was a friend of his, as well as possibly the philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Rembrandt used Jews as models for many of his paintings and seemed to have some knowledge about Judaism. In his painting Summer at Emmaus, the loaf of bread Jesus is eating is a braided challah. It was Rembrandt's friend Manasseh ben Israel who led a delegation seeking permission for Dutch Sephardim to settle in England. Cromwell was known to look favorably on the request, but we don't know that he officially sanctioned it. 1656, during the time of Charles II, is cited as the official year of readmission. A congregation of Spanish and Portuguese Jews formed a synagogue in Creech Church Lane, and Bevis Mark Synagogue was opened in 1701. Other S&P congregations were established in Manchester and Birmingham. Probably the most famous figure in the S&P community was Sir Moses Montefiore, a businessman who devoted most of his life to philanthropy, especially in helping Jews settle in Jerusalem outside the walls of the Old City. Montefiore built the famous windmill meant to produce flour, part of a broader program to enable Jews of Palestine to support themselves. He built a printing press and a textile factory and helped to finance several agricultural colonies. Interesting note, the mill was not a success due to a lack of wind. He was quite tall, especially for his time, at 6'3", and lived to be 100 years old. Spanish and Portuguese Jews also made their way to Northern Europe. We think of Germany as typically Ashkenazic, but Portuguese and Spanish Jews found their way to Hamburg via the Netherlands in the late 1500s. When it was discovered that they had been observing Jewish customs, some locals demanded their expulsion, but the city council, pointing to the economic benefits, let them stay. They continued to speak their native tongue, and so we find that about 15 Jewish books in Portuguese and Spanish were printed in Hamburg from 1618 to 1756. Spanish Jews also made their way across the Pyrenees Mountains to Bayonne and Bordeaux in southern France. In 1550, they were granted rights of residence as New Christians, but it was not until the early 1700s that they could openly profess themselves as Jews. While the Livorno Jews made their mark with books, the Jews of Bayonne made their mark with chocolate, thanks to the new Christian traders who brought the cocoa bean from South America and showed how to convert it, making Bayonne the chocolate capital of France. 1 century later, the local chocolate makers created a guild and swiftly excluded Jews from it. Famous members of the Bayonne community include René Cassin, 1887 to 1976, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in drafting the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also former Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France, who has Sephardi roots in Bayonne. Parisian Jews may be familiar with the Temple Bouffo Synagogue. This was established in the 1887 period with financing from a Jewish businessman from Bordeaux on the stipulation that it maintained the S&P minhag. Besides going to South America and coming back with the cocoa bean, Jews established communities in places such as Jamaica, 1530, Suriname, 1630s, Curacao, 1651, and St. Thomas in 1655. And as you can see in these photos, they covered the floors of their synagogues in sand. There are two explanations given. One is when they were praying secretly during the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal, they would cover the floor in sand to muffle their footsteps, to be hidden from the Inquisition. And a second explanation is a sign of the Jews wandering the desert for 40 years. In 2008, an old Jewish cemetery was discovered outside Kingston, Jamaica, in which tombstones had not only Hebrew writing, but were also marked with the skull and crossbones. Could these be pirate symbols? If accounts are to be believed, Jewish pirates of Jamaica named their ships for ancient Jewish heroes and prophets like Samuel, Queen Esther, and the Shield of Abraham. They targeted Spanish and Portuguese merchant ships. One of the most famous so-called Jewish pirates was Moses Cohen Enriquez Inez, who in 1628 helped lead the only successful capture of a Spanish treasure ship. Another potentially Jewish pirate is Jean Lafitte, who is said by some sources to have come from Bayonne or Bordeaux and had a Jewish grandmother. It was in 1654 that the first Jews arrived in North America, 23 of them, mostly of Spanish and Portuguese origin. They had been living in Recife, Brazil. But when the Portuguese defeated the Dutch there and brought the Inquisition, the Jews fled. Some returned to Amsterdam, others went to places in the Caribbean such as St. Thomas, Jamaica, Suriname, and Curacao. But one group of 23 Jews landed in New Amsterdam after being rescued by a French ship from Spanish pirates. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted them to leave. However, they appealed to the Dutch East India Company, which told Stuyvesant to let them stay as long as they looked after their own. And so they stayed, and founding the first Jewish congregation in America, Shearith Israel, Remnant of Israel, in 1654. The first Jewish minister born in the Americas was Gershom Mendes Satius, a strong patriot to the American cause. Despite his abhorrence of war, Satius regularly called in his sermons on God to bless the Revolution, Congress, and General George Washington. He considered the American cause, with its emphasis on individual liberty, as a just war, and independence a blessing for America's Jews. In 1787, when George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States, Satius was one of the clergymen in attendance. Another of Shearith Israel's famous congregants is Emma Lazarus, who wrote the famous poem inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." Only 4 years later, in 1658, the small but growing colony of Newport, Rhode Island, received its first Jewish residents, 15 families from Barbados. Their beautiful synagogue building, known as the Truro Synagogue, is the oldest in the United States, dating to 1763. In 1790, 3 months after Rhode Island had joined the United States, George Washington visited Newport to rally support for the new Bill of Rights. Afterward, he wrote a letter to the congregation, said to be one of the most profound letters on religious freedom. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the good will of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Another of the earliest Jewish communities in America is Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. One of its most famous members is Chaim Solomon, perhaps the greatest Jewish patriot in the Revolutionary War. Solomon was born in Poland and developed fluency in several languages before reaching New York in 1772, where he became a successful merchant. But as the revolution emerged, he quickly became involved. Twice he was arrested by the British and eventually escaped to Philadelphia, where he essentially became the lead financier for the revolution. But he also stood up for his fellow Jews. Solomon helped lead the successful fight to repeal a test oath which barred Jews and other non-Christians from holding public office in Pennsylvania. Spanish and Portuguese Jews settled all along the east coast of the Americas, as far north as Montreal, where a flourishing community was established, and in the south, in places like New Orleans, Savannah, and Charleston. Finally, we come full circle, returning our story to Portugal, where a Jewish community was once again re-established in Lisbon in the 1800s by Jews returning from Morocco. In the 1920s, a Portuguese captain, Arturo Carlos de Barros Pasto, returned to his Jewish roots and worked to encourage other secret Jews to come out. In 1838, he helped establish a synagogue in the northern city of Porto with the help of S&P communities in New York, Amsterdam, and elsewhere. Poignantly, that same year, 200 synagogues were destroyed in Europe, and this synagogue, in a country that had once persecuted the Jews, became a refuge for Jews escaping Nazism, with Jews literally sleeping on the floor of the synagogue. Another name well worth knowing is Aristides de Sola Mendes, also potentially a descendant of conversos. As the consul in Bordeaux, he issued some 30,000 visas, including about 10,000 to Jews over the period of just a few days, thus saving them from the Nazis. In response, the authoritarian government of Salazar stripped him of his diplomatic position, took his home, and forbade him from earning a living. After enormous efforts to rehabilitate his name, on March 18, 1988, the Portuguese Parliament officially dismissed all charges, restoring him to the diplomatic corps and honoring him with a standing ovation. Spain's expulsion edict was not revoked until 1869, and its recognition of Israel came finally in 1986. And in 2012, the Spanish government announced it would offer citizenship to those still practicing Jews it expelled, and the Portuguese government has also done the same. Finally, we should also point out that Spanish and Portuguese Jews have returned to Eretz Yisrael, and in particular Jerusalem, where you may enjoy a Spanish and Portuguese service just steps away from the Western Wall. Life goes on.